Good morning, and welcome to Tuesdays with the Pilgrim, as we continue our journey, A Prophet in Babylon, Chapter 10, Part A, The Dissimulation of Margaret. When Margaret Gaunt had spoken so cheerfully of giving up her house, in which all of her married life had been lived, she was guilty of dissimulation. It was the kind of dissimulation of which all good women are guilty, for what good woman is not constantly engaged in suppressing herself for the sake of those she loves? "I'd really rather not take a holiday this year," says the tired wife, who knows the economy forced on her by narrow means. Or, "I really like sitting up at night. It doesn't tire me at all. And you, dear, have your work to think of," says the mother when a sick child has to be watched and nursed through midnight hours. And she says these things with such a show of sincerity and conviction that she finds herself believed. Perhaps she is a little hurt to find herself believed so readily, but if she is, she takes care to hide the wound. It is only one wound more upon a heart that has endured so many. And after all, the great thing is that those she loves would be happy and content, and take their day upon the seashore or in the woods, and sleep when all the world sleeps, as their right. And it is a little hard, as years go on, to find the child taking pleasure with a thoughtless joy and saying, "Oh, mother won't be lonely if we go our own way. You know she likes to be alone." Or perhaps the husband, used to leaning on her strength, quietly assuming that that strength has no limit of endurance. And is she tired? Suppose you should wake up in the hour when the gray dawn breaks, and the fitful wailing of the sick child is hushed at last. Will you find no marks of fatigue in the mother's face? Tired, so tired that every bone aches and cries for sleep. But she will never say so. And an hour later you will find her so bright and active that the memory of those drawn features and relaxed hands on which the cold dawn of light fell will seem a thing you dreamed. And would not she also, oh so thoughtless child, love to lie upon the warm sea sand and rest beneath the green arches of the woods with you? She who was once as young as you, and recollects a good time long ago when she was never vexed with unpaid bills, and stoves that wouldn't burn, and servants that wouldn't work, and all the complicated details and annoyances of household management? But she will never say so. She will let you go on thinking that she is never happier than when she is baking bread or making pies for you to eat, and stitching clothes for you to wear. And if anyone of stricter vision should call you selfish, she will at once rise up to your defense, and do vehement battle, and declare that it is not selfishness at all, but just your natural right to enjoy life. It would be a dreadful world if those with whom we have to live in closest bonds saw all our defects with a vision never less than accurate, or, seeing those defects, spoke of them as a stranger might, with a judgment that was mercilessly just. And so it is one of woman's great arts to dissimulate, and it is her finest charm and grace, an art which the inherited traditions of renunciation through many centuries have wrought to such perfectness that only now and then do those she loves suspect the illusion, and when they do she will blush for its discovery. On such a theme what pages might be written, which it would not be good for men who dwell in lonely homes, out of which the dead have passed, to read alone at night, or beside the campfires in strange foreign lands where sons think of distant homes and vanished faces. They might produce that remorse too terrible for tears, which makes life itself seem unendurable. And so let us rather thank God that this is woman's nature, that she is content to sacrifice and be forgotten, that in her dissimulation it is but the expression of the unselfishness so profound that it makes a grace of falsehood, and turns a weakness into an illustrious kind of fortitude, beside which the thing we call courage on a battlefield appears coarse and grotesque. Margaret Gaunt, being a good woman, was wise, and so when her husband chose a new path for himself, she followed meekly, schooling herself to think it was the very path she would have chosen. She met him with smiles, talking lightly of the settlement girl and the kind of home that she had established in the slums. but all the while her own heart clung desperately to this home of hers, which was the monument of her own taste, discretion, and womanly pride. There was not a room in it which did not appeal to some memory, some tender sentiment. Here and there things had happened, the small, memorable things that make up a woman's world, and each was like a tiny shrine in which the lamp burned. There was one room in the house which she and her husband had never entered save on tiptoe, and they never went together. If one had found the other there by accident, the one would go away silently without daring say a word. For there had been born her one child, there he had died, and the silence of death had never left the room. She would often go there when the evening shadows fell, and recall that brief ecstasy of motherhood, and almost fancy she saw a golden child sleeping in the sunbeam that fell across the bed. And Gaunt always opened the door of the room for an instant as he went up to bed at night, and stood listening, as if for a sleeper's breath. But though each knew what the other did, neither had dared mention it. They never mentioned it, yet it was a bond between them. Had they been in any serious peril of drifting apart, the memories of that room would have stayed their feet. If there was one thing more bitter than another to the heart of Margaret in the thought of leaving this house, it was that someone else would live in that room, some other child, perhaps strong and sturdy, before whose happy laughter her frail ghost child would be driven out. If she could have taken that room with her, she would not have grieved so much, although every room had its own fragrance of association. But that a stranger's feet should tread there seemed an insult and a sacrilege. And yet, you see, she was a woman of placid brows and cheerful speech, of the kind called practical, and there were a great many people who thought they knew her well, who never even knew she had had a child, who came with the spring flowers years ago and went away with the summer's heat. And then there were other things, too, in which Margaret practiced her gracious art of dissimulation. For instance, she made a great deal in her talk with her husband of her difficulties with her hired help. But that was simply her method of preparing him for the dreadful moment when she meant to do without any help at all. For if her husband knew nothing about how the money went, she knew. You can't resign a fixed and ample salary and go on living just as though you had it. At least you can't do it honestly. Her poor babe of genius, as she often called him in a kind of maternal irony, might suppose that he could easily earn enough money by his pen for his own simple wants and hers, which was no doubt true, but when you added 2 hired girls and a man, each gifted with stupendous appetites and a long-practiced power of wastefulness, why, then the problem took another phase. So she quietly dismissed her staff and got cheap occasional help instead, and he never guessed the truth at all, and never learned its inwardness, but accepted her statement without question that she had found it necessary to make a change, so easily is man hoodwinked by a smiling face in woman. For of course she made a jest of it, and almost made him feel that it was a kind of special providence left her servantless. The house was so much quieter without them, while all the time her one desire and purpose was to save a little money against the hour of need. But these were trifles compared with the strain put upon her powers of dissimulation by affairs at the church. There was scarce a Sunday now when something did not happen that tried her patience. All sorts of spiteful gossip came to her, and false reports, and often wounding words would be spoken to her which brought angry tears to her eyes. Things that no one would have dared say to Gaunt were said to her, in the expectation that they would reach him through her, and so inflict a double wound. But they never did, for she hid them in her heart and pondered them in secret, but never let him know. And it is surprising how much can be said without words, how contemptuous pity or aversion can manage to convey a world of pain by a cold glance, or a shrug of the shoulder, or a capacity for not seeing you in the street, or taking another road when you appear. It is not pleasant to be asked with such singular pointedness how your husband's health is, that the inference is conveyed that the questioner is thinking of his mind rather than his body. Nor, is he better? In the tone of one who assumes that he is in the last stages of decay. Nor to hear a soft purring female voice proclaim in a discreet whisper, My dear, how I pity you." And Margaret's blood burned under these feline amenities. But Gaunt, poor man, never knew why her color was so high when she came from church. He imagined that it was the rose of health, not of anger, that flamed upon her cheek. And he congratulated her, telling her how well she looked. And she smiled back at him, as though it were the most natural thing in the world to endure the smart of petty insult and say no word about it. For instance, there was Mrs. Small, the wife of Deacon Small, a large, plain woman who emulated the bluff manners of her husband and made it her boast that she always said what she thought. That kind of boast usually implies an entire incapacity for understanding what other people think. Certainly it did so with Mrs. Small. By dint of long cultivation, in what was no doubt a natural gift of rudeness, Mrs. Small had earned for herself the reputation of a censor of everybody's methods of life, and she found the church an admirable arena for her exertions. She never failed to let Margaret know when she thought the sermon was too long, or when she disagreed with it. "If your husband preached shorter, it would be much better for his health, and for our comfort too," she said bluntly one day. "He forgets that he is preaching to the tired businessman who really can't follow a long sermon. The businessman likes it short and simple." "Likes it predigested like grape nuts," retorted Margaret with a smiling irony. "But you see, there are other people in the church beside tired businessmen who are quite capable of doing their own intellectual digestion." That was not a wise speech of Margaret's, for Mrs. Small, like most stupid people, did not understand irony and was enraged by it. So she went away and said she was very sorry for the minister. It was evident that his wife did not appreciate him, for had she not compared his discourses with grape nuts? And we'll stop there for this week. Next week we'll pick up with Chapter 10, Part B. Until then, take care, stay safe, and God bless.